The rain had just begun to taper off, leaving the cobbled streets of St. Mary's Lane slick and glistening in the lamplight, when Miss Marple arrived at the scene of the troubling case. The air still carried the faint, metallic scent of blood, mingled with the sweet, almost cloying aroma of wax polish and rosewater that lingered from the parlor where the crime had taken place. It was a small, immaculately kept house, its windows shuttered against the chill, its front door locked, yet slightly ajar from where the maid had called in her desperate confusion. Inside, the chaos of violence seemed almost surreal against the domestic perfection. The lace curtains untouched, the silver teapot gleaming on the sideboard, and in the center of the drawing room, a dollhouse so intricately detailed it might have been a miniature palace. Yet it was this dollhouse, perched on its stand like an innocent toy, that drew Marple's attention first, for inside its tiny rooms lay an object both curious and unsettling, a delicate porcelain figurine, fractured at the base, as if in silent testimony to the brutal reality that had just unfolded in the real house. Inspector Craddock had already examined the body. A middle-aged man named Jonathan Penhaligon, who was found slumped over the library desk, with no visible wounds except a faint contusion at the back of the head. He had been discovered by the housekeeper, Miss Lewis, who swore she had left him alive only an hour before. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints other than the maid's, no fingerprints outside those belonging to the household staff. The entire scene seemed to mock logic. The locked study door, the undisturbed furniture, the faint hint of a struggle. Craddock muttered grimly about the impossibility of the case, scratching at his thinning hair, while Marple's keen eyes swept the room in methodical arcs. Her gaze lingered on the dollhouse, on the minuscule furniture that mirrored the very room she stood in. It was a precise replica. The rug, the chandelier, even the tiny copies of books on the library shelf, and the broken figurine at its center felt deliberately placed. Marple moved closer, her fingers tracing the edges of the miniature table, her mind racing through possibilities. This was no ordinary murder. The killer had not simply struck in anger. There was an almost ceremonial quality to the scene, as though the crime itself had been arranged to communicate something obscure. The figurine's fracture mirrored the very shape of a crack she had noticed in the desk, an almost imperceptible mark along the walnut veneer. She wondered quietly whether the perpetrator had intended for someone with a perceptive eye to notice the parallel. The housekeeper's explanation stumbled at odd points, claims of being busy in the kitchen, a misplaced key, the distant sound of the mailman. Yet Miss Marple detected the hesitation, the subtle inflection that suggested she was omitting something, or perhaps trying to protect someone. As Craddock busied himself taking photographs and questioning the staff, Marple stepped into the library, her eyes resting on the shelf of rare books. She noted the titles, the slight disorder in one corner, a small stack of correspondence tied with a faded ribbon. Among them was a letter addressed to Penhaligon, its edges scorched, as if someone had hastily tried to destroy it. The words she could make out hinted at blackmail, yet the author remained obscured by the curling paper. She pocketed the fragment, feeling the weight of the hidden message, and turned to examine the window. It was latched securely, as she had suspected, yet the curtain bore a faint smear of something dark, nearly invisible in the dim light. Blood? Ink? It was hard to say, but it confirmed her suspicion. The killer had moved with extraordinary caution, yet had left this tiny, almost inconsequential mark, as if to challenge anyone daring enough to notice it. A soft creak behind her made Marple whirl. The maid had returned, a bundle of nerves clutching a tray of tea she had forgotten in her fluster. Marple's smile was gentle but probing, and she asked casually about the household routines, the timing of meals, the daily comings and goings. Each answer was a thread she could pull, each hesitation a knot to unravel. And then she asked about the dollhouse. Miss Lewis faltered. It's just a toy, ma'am," she said, her voice tight. Marple nodded slowly. "Of course," she murmured, though her mind traced the significance of the miniature rooms. Who had placed the broken figurine there? Who had manipulated the toy with such meticulous care? And why? The answers, Marple knew, would not be found in rash assumptions. They lay in the quiet, deliberate observation of details others overlooked. the subtle dislocation of a book, the faint bruise behind an ear, the miniature tableau that mirrored reality. As the night deepened, the house seemed to settle into a tense silence as though awaiting her deductions. Craddock paced, muttering doubts, but Marple stood firm, cataloguing every anomaly in her mind. Each clue, trivial as it might appear, was a piece of the puzzle, leading toward an understanding of the impossible. By dawn, she had formed the outline of the truth, not yet complete, but compelling enough to see that this was a crime designed, not for passion or greed alone, but for meaning, for message. The cursed dollhouse, with its fractured figurine and miniature library, was both key and confession. A coded riddle only someone of careful observation could hope to decipher, and Miss Marple, with her patient eye and intuitive clarity, would unravel it before the killer had a chance to vanish into obscurity. Miss Marple returned to the house the following morning, carrying with her a quiet sense of purpose that contrasted sharply with the bustling energy of the police contingent. The rain had ceased, leaving the streets of St. Mary's Lane sparkling with dew and the faint scent of wet earth, but inside the Penhaligon residence, the tension from the previous evening still lingered like a stubborn fog. The inspector was already present, surrounded by assistants dusting for fingerprints and cataloguing the few items that seemed out of place. Yet even amid this flurry of official procedure, Marple's attention was drawn to the subtlest of anomalies, the kind that often went unnoticed by those too committed to routine. Her eyes first returned to the dollhouse, which had remained untouched on its stand. Its meticulous detail fascinated her still. The tiny rug that mirrored the library carpet, the chandelier made of glass beads, and the miniature books that somehow matched the real volumes. But it was the broken figurine, so carefully fractured, that captured her curiosity. Kneeling beside it, she examined the splintered edges and the fine pattern of the porcelain, noting the unusual placement. Whoever had broken it had done so deliberately, as though the action itself were meant to convey a message, and yet the precise reason remained elusive. Moving on, Marple's gaze swept over the room, taking in the minutiae that often escaped. Others. A chair was slightly ajar, a book protruded from the shelf just a fraction too far, and the faint indentation of a handprint was pressed into the soft wax of the polished desk. Each of these observations seemed minor in isolation, but together they formed a trail of subtle signals. She noticed that one of the letters in the correspondence bundle was slightly skewed, the ink smudged in a way that suggested it had been handled recently. Her fingers, deft and precise, lifted the letter, revealing a short note scrawled in a hand unfamiliar to her. "The secret lies within the past, but only if you dare to look." The message was cryptic, almost theatrical, yet the manner of its concealment hinted at urgency and fear. Marple's attention shifted to the household staff. Miss Lewis, the housekeeper, moved about with polite efficiency, but there was a tension in her posture, a tightness around the shoulders and neck, that suggested more than mere anxiety over a morning's duties. When Marple engaged her in conversation about the events leading up to the murder, her answers were careful, bordering on rehearsed. "I was just preparing breakfast, Miss Marple," she said, glancing fleetingly at the locked study door. "Mr. Penhaligon had seemed in good spirits when I left him." Her voice faltered for a heartbeat, and Marple caught the slightest quiver in her hands as she folded a napkin. The maid, a younger woman named Clara, was even more conspicuously nervous. She avoided eye contact, her hands twisting the hem of her apron as if it could anchor her to reality. Marple noted the timing of their movements with care, observing how the two women interacted. There was an almost imperceptible hierarchy. Lewis issued subtle directions, which Clara followed with a deferential anxiety, yet both were clearly aware of something unspoken. It was in these fleeting gestures, the small exchanges of glances and half-smiles, that Marple detected the first hints of deception. Something in the household dynamic had changed recently, and it was likely intertwined with the mystery of the murder. A peculiar object caught her eye next, a silver bookmark, resting on the mantelpiece in a position that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. It was engraved with initials, J.P., which could only refer to the deceased. But it was the location and orientation that intrigued her. The bookmark was not in the desk where Mr. Penhaligon might have used it, but prominently displayed, almost as though it were meant to be found. Marple turned it over in her hands, noting a faint smudge of a reddish substance, barely noticeable, yet distinct against the silver sheen. It was too small to have been a part of the struggle, too carefully positioned to be an oversight. To Marple, it suggested a symbolic gesture, perhaps intended for someone who knew exactly what to look for. The detective's keen eye also detected subtle inconsistencies in the room itself. The window latches bore faint traces of handling, though there had been no signs of forced entry. The rug in front of the fireplace was slightly askew, and a single feather, dark and small, had fallen onto the otherwise immaculate parquet. Marple knelt and examined it. It seemed out of place, as though dropped by a visitor in a hurry or perhaps by the intruder themselves. Each of these small clues, she realized, was a deliberate distraction or a breadcrumb, meant either to confuse investigators or to direct them along a carefully plotted path. As she examined the tiny trinkets on the sideboard, Marple noticed an unusual reaction from Miss Lewis. When her gaze lingered on the porcelain figurine again, the housekeeper's composure wavered ever so slightly. There was a flicker of recognition, or was it guilt, in her eyes. She stepped back quickly, brushing her hands against her apron as though to remove some imagined dust. But Marple's perceptive mind catalogued the moment with precision. The response was fleeting, but the way it aligned with the strange arrangement of objects suggested that the housekeeper knew more than she admitted. Marple paused by the library desk, studying the faint marks on its polished surface, the indentation of a hand, the scuff of a shoe on the edge of the rug, even the slightly shifted books, all formed a pattern that suggested movement, but one orchestrated with care. Whoever had committed the murder had been familiar with the house, its routines and its occupants. The crime was executed with both knowledge and calculation, yet the killer had left these subtle signals, as though taunting anyone perceptive. Enough to notice. Miss Marple, of course, noticed. She allowed her thoughts to trace the possible sequence of events, mentally reconstructing the moments before the discovery of the body. By midday, Craddock had grown impatient with her methodical attention to detail. He muttered about following procedure, checking alibis and cataloguing evidence, but Marple merely smiled politely and continued her examination. She had begun to sense the outlines of the deception, the first whispers of hidden motives and clandestine communications. The fractured figurine, the cryptic letter, the odd positioning of the bookmark, the reactions of the staff, all pointed toward an elaborate orchestration, one that demanded patience and subtle reasoning rather than hasty assumptions. As the morning wore on, Marple retraced her steps from room to room, noting the consistencies and the anomalies. She observed that a single window in the back, often overlooked, bore a faint smudge that corresponded to the mark on the miniature table within the dollhouse. She made a mental note, suspecting a connection between the real and the miniature, an echo of intention deliberately planted to convey a hidden narrative. The house itself seemed to whisper secrets, each detail a piece of the intricate puzzle she had begun to assemble in her mind. By the time she concluded her initial inspection, Miss Marple had identified not only the subtle signs of deception among the staff, but also the threads connecting the objects within the room. Yet the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach, a puzzle assembled but not yet solved. She realized that the true story lay hidden behind the meticulous facade of domestic order, behind the careful orchestration of objects, gestures, and reactions. And she understood with that quiet certainty that had served her so well that every small clue, no matter how insignificant it appeared to others, was a step closer to unraveling the mystery of the cursed dollhouse and the man who had perished within its shadow. The first hints of deception had emerged, subtle and almost imperceptible, but for Miss Marple, they were the starting point. With patience, observation, and careful deduction, she would follow these faint signals through the labyrinth of secrets the household sought to conceal. The day was far from over, and already the threads were beginning to converge toward a truth that would leave even the most confident investigator astounded. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon in the drawing room, where the house's occupants had gathered under the polite insistence of Inspector Craddock. The room was bright with the slanting sunlight that fell through the high windows, yet the air was thick with tension. Each member of the household carried their own version of the previous day's events, and Miss Marple, with her characteristic, quiet observation, prepared to untangle the threads of half-truths and misdirection that would inevitably emerge. She began with Miss Lewis, the housekeeper, who had already shown signs of unease the morning before. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, as I told you, ma'am, Lewis began, her voice tight and measured, glancing nervously at the inspector who was taking notes. I heard nothing unusual until I found him. Oh, I can't believe this happened. Her hands trembled as she dabbed at a corner of her apron. Marple watched her intently, noticing how her eyes flicked momentarily toward the dollhouse, then away, as though acknowledging an unspoken significance. You were the last to see him alive? Miss Marple asked softly, almost as an aside. Yes, ma'am, the housekeeper replied, but the hesitancy in her tone betrayed the simplicity of the statement. Next came Clara, the young maid, whose nervous energy was almost palpable. I don't know what to say, she stammered, wringing her hands. I was dusting in the front hall when I heard a sound from the library. I thought it was Mr. Penhaligon dropping a book, and by the time I reached him, it was too late. Her gaze flitted repeatedly to Miss Lewis, who returned the look with an almost imperceptible shake of her head. Marple noted the synchronization. Two women, both careful in their speech, but giving away small contradictory signals. Clara's insistence on being occupied elsewhere and Lewis's claim to be in the kitchen suggested a gap in their timelines that had yet to be accounted for. The discussion moved on to Jonathan Penhaligon's solicitor, Mr. Carmichael, who had been summoned upon hearing of the tragedy. Penhaligon had recently received letters regarding his family estate, he explained, adjusting his spectacles with a precision that suggested nervousness or calculated caution. He was concerned about a codicil in his uncle's will, a matter of inheritance that, well, it could have caused disagreements. Marple raised a delicate eyebrow. It was not the first time she had encountered murder intertwined with property and legacy, yet she sensed that the solicitor, despite his polite exterior, was withholding something more immediate. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers fidgeted with a paperweight, hinted at knowledge he was reluctant to disclose. Each witness seemed to offer a variant of events, yet none were entirely consistent with the physical evidence Marple had already catalogued. Miss Lewis spoke of breakfast preparations, Clara of dusting and a mysterious noise, and Carmichael hinted at letters and legal matters. Marple's mind, however, could detect what the others overlooked, the invisible intersections between these stories. A door left ajar, a shifted rug, the smudged bookmark. They all suggested movement, presence, and a sequence of events that did not align perfectly with any of the accounts given. She turned her attention to subtle behavioral cues. Miss Lewis's eagerness to cooperate was telling. She answered every question promptly without pause, her words flowing with a practiced ease. Yet it was precisely this eagerness that aroused Marple's suspicion. Those who are too quick to assist often do so to control the narrative, to hide something behind a curtain of compliance. Clara, by contrast, was withholding, careful not to overstate, reluctant to speak unless pressed. Her avoidance of eye contact and small gestures of discomfort suggested fear, perhaps not of the authorities, but of someone in the house itself. Marple asked each witness about the dollhouse, a topic she approached with delicate tact. The figurine, have either of you noticed anything unusual about it? She inquired, keeping her voice calm, almost conversational. Miss Lewis stiffened, her hands tightening around the edge of her apron. It's just a toy, ma'am. Nothing to do with—" She broke off abruptly. Clara's response was equally hesitant. I didn't touch it, ma'am. I just dusted it, that's all. The tiny reactions, though seemingly insignificant, were recorded carefully in Marple's mind. Both women recognized the importance of the object and, in their different ways, betrayed subtle acknowledgement of the figurine's role in the wider mystery. As evening descended, the house seemed to settle into a tense quiet, the shadows stretching long across the floors and walls. Miss Marple remained at her post, a steady presence amid uncertainty. The web of motives, though intricate, was beginning to yield its logic. Each contradiction, each hesitation, each small gesture or smudge of evidence was a part of the whole. Patience and observation would allow her to navigate the maze, separating false leads from genuine signals, and eventually, the pattern of intent and opportunity would emerge clearly. She rose, stretching slightly, her thoughts already moving toward the next steps. The tangled motives of the household were no longer abstract possibilities. They were a network of human impulses waiting to be decoded. The cursed dollhouse was no longer merely a mysterious artifact. It was a key, a mirror reflecting the desires, fears, and resentments that had collided in fatal consequence. Miss Marple knew that the following day's inquiries would bring her closer to the heart of the crime, and she felt a quiet certainty that the strands she was tracing through greed, jealousy, revenge, and fear would ultimately converge to reveal the murderer hiding among them. The next morning brought a flurry of excitement to the Penhaligon house. A small, seemingly inconsequential discovery had ignited the authorities' enthusiasm. A glove, slightly bloodied, found tucked behind a cushion on the parlor settee. Craddock, convinced he had finally unearthed a breakthrough, gathered the household and announced that they had found the key evidence linking the crime to one suspect. The air buzzed with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The staff exchanged nervous glances, while Clara bit her lip, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Even the solicitor, Mr. Carmichael, nodded with a tight-lipped expression, carefully masking his inner curiosity. Miss Marple, however, did not share their excitement. She had inspected the glove the previous evening, and while it appeared to be compelling, something about it unsettled her deeply. The leather was soft and well-worn, the size not unusual, and yet the positioning behind the cushion seemed deliberate, almost staged. It was a discovery intended to mislead, a carefully planted signpost pointing toward the wrong conclusion. She noted how neatly it had been concealed. The edges were folded inward, not as they would have been had it fallen accidentally during a struggle. It was, in her mind, an emblem of the killer's subtle manipulation, a piece of evidence designed to offer the illusion of closure while masking the truth. Craddock, buoyed by the glove, questioned Miss Lewis first, insisting she explain its presence. The housekeeper's composure was impeccable, though a faint flush crept up her neck. I haven't seen it, Inspector," she replied evenly, hands clasped in front of her. Clara, in turn, looked startled, almost as if someone had whispered the answer into her ear, yet she too denied knowledge. The air in the room grew tense, but Craddock was undeterred. "Well, one of you must have dropped it," he said firmly, confident that he was closing in on the perpetrator. The inspector's determination to declare the case solved, however, only deepened Miss Marple's scrutiny. She wandered the drawing room quietly, letting her eyes and fingers trace familiar contours. The polished desk, the slight misalignment of books, the rug that had been shifted the previous day. She returned to the dollhouse where the fractured figurine still stood. The tiny room seemed to echo the chaos outside it, and she studied the placement carefully, noting subtle inconsistencies that suggested a timeline at odds with Craddock's presumptions. The glove, as convincing as it appeared, did not account for the smudged bookmark, the faint handprint in the desk wax, or the sequence of movements she had observed among the staff. Marple decided to question the household in a more measured, quiet way, separating them one at a time from the collective pressure of Craddock's optimism. She first spoke with Clara, the young maid, who had seemed hesitant from the beginning. "Clara," she began gently, "this glove, did you see it before it was found yesterday?" The girl's eyes widened slightly and she shook her head. "No, Miss Marple, I didn't notice it, I promise." But Marple's keen eye caught the slight twitch of her fingers, a signal that perhaps she was guarding a memory or a truth too delicate to reveal openly. "And the dollhouse?" she continued. "Did anyone else handle it?" Clara faltered, glanced toward Miss Lewis and whispered, "Only Miss Lewis, Ma'am. She moved the figurine once, but I didn't think anything of it." Miss Marple's mind raced. The glove could easily have been planted by someone aware that Craddock would seize upon any tangible evidence. The subtle interplay of gestures, Half-truths and careful timing indicated that the real criminal was observing the investigation, allowing false leads to flourish while remaining safely in the shadows. Greed, jealousy, and fear had already woven a web of potential culprits, but this staged discovery suggested a mind far more calculating than simple emotional motive alone. She turned her attention to Miss Lewis. "You noticed nothing unusual." "About the figurine?" Marple asked casually, keeping her voice low and friendly. The housekeeper hesitated, a shadow crossing her features. "It was just the toy, ma'am. I arranged it to make the room tidy, that's all." But Marple detected the subtext. There was an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that the dollhouse had been manipulated. This admission, though minor, was significant. It meant the person responsible had a method, leaving clues that were interpretable only by a careful observer. Even Mr. Carmichael, the solicitor, was not above scrutiny. "The letters," she asked him softly. "You mentioned concerns regarding inheritance. Is there anything more you can tell me about their content?" He adjusted his spectacles, exhaling carefully. "I've said all that I can, Miss Marple," he replied with precision, though a faint tightening around his eyes suggested omission. "I would prefer not to speculate." Marple made a mental note. Knowledge kept hidden could be as telling as confessions spoken aloud. As the afternoon progressed, Craddock continued to press his conclusion, ready to announce that the case had been resolved. Miss Lewis was questioned again, and Clara's earlier nervousness now seemed almost performative, designed to reinforce the inspector's growing certainty. The glove, after all, appeared incriminating, and the authorities were eager for closure. Yet Marple lingered in quiet observation, revisiting the sequence of movements she had reconstructed in her mind. Who had touched the desk? Who had passed? The library window. How the minute details of the dollhouse mirrored the room itself. Something about the arrangement of evidence and the timing of statements did not align with a simple narrative of guilt. By evening, Craddock was preparing to file his preliminary report, already framing the narrative of solved crime. The household, relieved yet uneasy, had begun to relax slightly under the illusion of resolution. Miss Marple, however, lingered by the window, her hands folded, eyes focused on the dollhouse across the room. The fractured figurine, the smudged bookmark, the subtle footprints, all suggested that the true criminal was waiting, patiently, observing the misplaced confidence of those around them. Her intuition, honed through years of careful deduction, whispered a warning. The early victory, celebrated by the authorities, was false. The murderer had engineered a distraction, allowing the investigators to grasp at a convenient but misleading piece of evidence. The real danger, Marple understood, was that complacency would permit the culprit to strike again, unobserved, and, perhaps more decisively. Late into the evening, she catalogued the evidence once more, tracing the movements of each household member, the timing of their statements, and the placement of the objects that had drawn her attention from the start. The web of deception was more intricate than ever, and the glove, though superficially compelling, was merely a thread woven into a larger tapestry of misdirection. The real criminal had not yet revealed themselves, and Marple knew that patience, observation, and careful reasoning would be essential to seeing through the facade. The household settled into uneasy quiet, but the detective remained vigilant, keenly aware that the apparent resolution was only a mirage. The cursed dollhouse, with its fractured figurine and meticulously arranged miniatures, had already spoken once, offering clues that others ignored. And Marple, attentive and patient, understood that it would speak again, if only she was ready. To listen closely enough. Miss Marple returned to the Penhaligon house the following morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The excitement over the supposedly solved case had left a lingering tension in the household, a mixture of relief and unspoken unease. Craddock had departed to file his report, confident that the glove was the key, but Marple knew better. Something about the arrangement of objects, the reactions of the staff, and the fractured figurine had not yet yielded its full story. The house, she realized, contained echoes of the past, subtle remnants of incidents long forgotten, threads that now intertwined with the murder in ways the authorities had overlooked. Her attention first fell to the library, where she had previously examined the letters, and the correspondence tied with the faded ribbon. Among the neatly stacked documents, a small envelope, yellowed with age, had slipped beneath a larger pile. It bore no address or sender, only a faint wax seal stamped with an emblem she recognized from old police bulletins, the crest of a long-defunct law firm that had handled a series of mysterious disappearances in the county decades earlier. Marple's curiosity was piqued. She carefully opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but legible, a record of a dispute involving Jonathan Penhaligon's family, noting a series of inheritances, contested claims, and an unusually heated argument between two relatives, names that now resonated with her from previous cases she had quietly followed over the years. The connection was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to Marple it was significant. The disputes outlined in the document mirrored the tensions currently simmering within the household. The solicitor, Mr. Carmichael, had been aware of these historical conflicts, perhaps even handling some of the estates himself, which explained his measured hesitation in revealing details. The housekeeper and the maid, though more intimately tied to the present events, might have been influenced indirectly by the residue of these old feuds. It became clear to Marple that the murder could not be understood solely in terms of immediate greed or resentment. It had roots in a series of entanglements stretching back years, perhaps decades. She recalled the peculiar reactions she had observed the previous day. Miss Lewis's nervous glance at the dollhouse, Clara's hesitance to speak freely, the solicitor's subtle tightening of his fingers, all suggested that each had knowledge of past disputes, even if only in fragments. The old envelope confirmed what Marple had long suspected. The current tensions were layered atop historical grievances, amplifying jealousy, fear, and desire in ways that rendered the crime far more complex than the authorities had assumed. Marple then turned to the household itself, thinking carefully about the relationships she had observed. The dynamic between Lewis and Clara, for instance, suddenly seemed less about immediate hierarchy and more about legacy. Miss Lewis had been in service for decades, a witness to family disputes that had quietly simmered beneath the surface. Clara, newer to the household, had unknowingly stepped into a web of unresolved tensions. The younger woman's fear and hesitation, once assumed to be simple nervousness, might be a reflection of her awareness of these older conflicts, perhaps even through overheard conversations or subtle insinuations from Lewis herself. The dollhouse, of course, remained central. Marple studied it again, noting the broken figurine and the placement of miniature furniture. It struck her that the arrangement mirrored not just the present library, but the configuration of rooms as they had existed 20 years earlier, according to family blueprints she had once seen in a previous investigation. The symbolism became clearer. The murderer had deliberately recreated a miniature version of the past, embedding reminders of long-forgotten quarrels into a tableau that mirrored real events. The act of fracturing the figurine, placing it deliberately, suggested a consciousness attuned to history, a message encoded in miniature form for someone perceptive enough to notice. She also examined the smudged bookmark and the faint handprint in the desk wax. In light of the historical documents, these small details took on new significance. The bookmark's placement and the handprint were not accidental. They were markers, guiding anyone attentive to the hidden narrative connecting past and present. Marple realized that the murderer's understanding of history was precise, that the crime had been carefully planned, with reference to events long buried. The web of relationships, both familial and professional, had persisted through decades, and the current murder was the inevitable climax of unresolved grievances. To confirm her suspicions, Marple revisited conversations she had had with the household staff. The evasions, the carefully measured hesitancy, the subtle cues, all now aligned with the knowledge that each person was enmeshed in a history they did not openly discuss. The housekeeper's protective behavior, once interpreted as mere authority or routine, now seemed influenced by a desire to shield the secrets of the past. Clara's timid deference could be interpreted as the cautious navigation of inherited tensions. Even the solicitor's careful avoidance of speculation took on greater meaning. He was aware of historical connections that he understood but could not disclose openly. Marple then considered the implications of this past connection for the murder itself. The seemingly random clues, the fractured figurine, the glove, the smudged bookmark, were not random at all. They were references, symbols meant to communicate the significance of history, to link the current act of violence to the long-forgotten conflicts of the Penhaligon family. The murderer had acted with knowledge, not only of human nature but of the persistent echoes of old grievances, weaving past and present into a single deliberate act. As she pieced together these connections, a pattern emerged. Each suspect's motive was layered, composed not only of immediate desires but also of historical pressures. Greed, jealousy, fear and revenge were all magnified by legacy, by a web of unresolved disputes that stretched back decades. The cursed dollhouse, with its miniature replication of the library and carefully fractured figurine, was more than an artifact of present intrigue. It was a message from the past, a signal that the murder could not be understood in isolation. By evening, Miss Marple had traced the outlines of this hidden network. The real crime was an intersection of old and new motives, a convergence of human emotion shaped by decades of history. The present-day actors were all players in a drama scripted long before they were born, responding to cues inherited from those who had come before. The revelation added depth and complexity to the investigation. The murderer was not merely someone acting on immediate impulse, but a figure who understood history and had deliberately employed it to construct both a scene of misdirection and a symbolic narrative. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the dimming light of the drawing room, felt the first real clarity of the case forming. The shadows of the past had been overlooked by all but her, yet they now illuminated the present in startling detail. The patterns, the subtle gestures, the seemingly insignificant artifacts, all were threads linking the suspects and their motives to events long forgotten. The cursed dollhouse, the fractured figurine, the glove and the smudged bookmark. All were symbols of continuity, reminders that history never truly fades and that unresolved grievances can resurface with devastating precision. The detective understood with that quiet certainty that had served her so well that the next steps would require not just observation, but strategic engagement. She needed to confront the household with a subtlety that revealed the connections without alarming the murderer, to watch for reactions that confirmed the hidden truths. The past was speaking through the present, and Miss Marple was listening closely, ready to unravel the full story before the shadows of history could claim another victim. Miss Marple had spent the morning quietly observing the household, letting the ebb and flow of activity reveal nuances that even Craddock might have missed. The house, though orderly on the surface, thrummed with tension. Each glance exchanged between Miss Lewis and Clara, every measured word from Mr. Carmichael, hinted at a network of carefully managed impressions. It was clear to Marple that the culprit was not only present, but acutely aware of the investigation, allowing herself a window into their psychology while setting subtle traps. Today, she decided, it was time to employ a method that would force the truth to reveal itself, not through interrogation, but through observation and carefully contrived suggestion. The drawing room had been chosen as the setting for her unconventional tactic. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, catching the polished surfaces of the furniture and the delicate glassware on the sideboard. She began by inviting the household staff to sit with her, framing a casual conversation about the events of the past week, carefully introducing elements that touched on both the present crime and the shadows of the past she had uncovered. Rather than direct questioning, she wove narratives and hypothetical scenarios, observing responses rather than forcing confessions. "Imagine," she said softly, knitting needles moving in gentle rhythm, "that one of us in this room had come across something quite alarming yesterday, a secret perhaps that could explain events from long ago. Would one feel compelled to reveal it immediately, or perhaps wait until a more convenient moment?" Her voice was serene, almost conversational, yet each word was loaded with a subtle invitation to react. Miss Lewis, sitting nearest, adjusted her posture and pressed her hands together. Clara's eyes widened, and Mr. Carmichael's fingers tapped lightly on the arm of his chair. Marple observed not the words themselves, but the micro-expressions, the flickers of discomfort, the brief avoidance of eye contact, the tightness around the mouth. Small, almost imperceptible cracks in composure, each revealing hidden anxieties. Marple then subtly shifted the discussion toward the dollhouse. She recounted the details of her observations, the fractured figurine, the miniature furniture, and the smudged bookmark, framing each as if they were innocent curiosities. "It is remarkable," she said lightly, "how sometimes the smallest objects can carry the greatest significance. A figurine broken by accident, or perhaps by design. A mark on a tiny book that reflects events in reality. Would one notice these things immediately, or could they go unobserved for days?" Her tone suggested nothing was suspicious, yet the emphasis was deliberate, inviting subconscious recognition. As she spoke, Clara's fingers twitched nervously. She glanced toward Miss Lewis, whose own expression stiffened for a fleeting moment. Marple's gaze did not linger accusingly, merely gentle observation, yet it was precise. The young maid's reaction was telling, a subtle tension that betrayed recognition, an acknowledgement that she understood the significance of the objects in a way that went beyond casual housekeeping. It was a slight crack in the veneer of innocence that Marple had been waiting for. Marple next employed another subtle tactic, introducing the element of observation by proxy. She described a scenario in which a small object, say a glove or a piece of correspondence, was discovered in a place it shouldn't be, and how such an object might be interpreted by an investigator. The narrative was hypothetical, detached, yet intentionally mirrored the discovery of the glove behind the cushion. She noted Miss Lewis's quiet stiffening and Clara's sudden clasping of her hands in her lap, both signs that the scenario had touched on truths they wished to obscure. Then, with her characteristic gentle curiosity, Marple asked a simple, seemingly unrelated question. "Do you remember, Miss Lewis, a story from years ago about a disagreement in this household? Something small at the time, but perhaps forgotten until now." The question was carefully calibrated. She did not push for details, did not frame it as accusatory, merely planted a seed. The subtle hesitation that followed, a blink too long, a slight tilt of the head was enough. Marple had witnessed hundreds of such reactions. They were not lies, merely the mind's quiet acknowledgement of a buried truth. The true breakthrough came when she asked Clara to retrieve the afternoon tea from the sideboard. As the girl moved, her hand brushed against the dollhouse. For an instant she paused, fingers hovering over the broken figurine. Her body stiffened, a slight shiver running through her shoulders. Marple's eyes, unerring, caught it immediately. Clara's reaction was not fear of punishment from the authorities. It was recognition, a personal understanding of what the dollhouse represented, the orchestration, the message, the deliberate symbolism. Here was a crack in the wall of deception, subtle but unmistakable. Miss Marple did not confront the girl directly, did not press for immediate confession. Instead, she allowed the moment to exist, noting every micro-expression, every hesitation. She observed how the housekeeper's glance flicked toward Clara, how Mr. Carmichael's hand tightened around a folded piece of paper. The responses were synchronized yet inconsistent, a choreography of subtle signals that betrayed the underlying truths. The method was unconventional, relying on psychology rather than physical evidence, but it was effective. By the late afternoon, Marple had gathered more than words could convey. The reactions she had elicited, the tiny cracks in composure, the fleeting gestures of acknowledgement, all pointed toward a specific awareness shared among the household members. Someone had orchestrated the scene, manipulating both objects and people to create false narratives. The glove, the broken figurine, even the smudged bookmark had served as instruments of misdirection, and the murderer's careful observation of the investigators had allowed them to remain concealed while letting others be momentarily implicated. Marple understood that the unconventional tactic, introducing hypothetical scenarios and observing subtle human reactions, had succeeded. The suspect had revealed awareness not through confession, but through the body's natural response to recognition. It was a quiet revelation, almost invisible to an untrained eye. Yet for Miss Marple, it was as illuminating as a confession spoken aloud. The true criminal was watching, calculating, but they had underestimated her patience and perceptiveness. As the household retired for the evening, the detective remained in the drawing room, quietly knitting and reflecting on the day's subtle triumph. The unconventional clue, Clara's reaction to the dollhouse, the hesitation in Miss Lewis's posture, the tightening of Mr. Carmichael's hand, had provided a critical insight. The threads of deception were fraying, revealing the contours of the truth beneath. Miss Marple knew that the real challenge was still ahead. The murderer remained in the shadows, waiting for the right moment, confident that the investigators were misled by the false victories of the past. Yet now, with this delicate psychological insight, she had a map, however faint, of the hidden connections and concealed intentions. The unconventional method had pierced the veil of deceit, and the first true understanding of the criminal's mindset was in her grasp. The detective rose, letting her gaze drift across the room one last time. The dollhouse, the symbolic miniature of real events, sat silently on its stand, fractured yet whole in its miniature world. Through patient observation, subtle suggestion, and careful attention to human behavior, Miss Marple had glimpsed the outline of the truth. The path to unraveling the full mystery of the cursed dollhouse had become clearer, but she knew that patience, ingenuity, and unwavering attention to the subtlest signals would be essential to finally exposing the culprit lurking in the shadows. Miss Marple awoke early the next morning, the weight of yesterday's subtle revelations still pressing gently at the back of her mind. The household had settled into a strained rhythm. Miss Lewis moved with meticulous precision. Clara flitted about nervously, and Mr. Carmichael spent long hours reviewing papers in the study, his expression tightly controlled. There was, as always, the illusion of calm, but Marple knew better. The murderer, she suspected, was now aware that the net of suspicion was beginning to tighten, and that meant they would act. Her intuition proved correct before the morning had truly begun. Upon entering the library to review the correspondence once more, she noticed immediately that something was amiss. The small envelope she had discovered earlier, the one containing the old legal dispute with its faint wax seal, was gone. At first she thought perhaps she had misplaced it, but a careful search revealed that it had not simply been moved. It had been removed deliberately. Even the dust on the shelf seemed slightly disturbed, a whisper of a hand having passed over it. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, reconstructing the chain of events. Whoever had taken the envelope knew its significance and had acted to erase the evidence before anyone else could act upon it. The implication was clear. The killer was not only careful but proactive, willing to manipulate both objects and people to maintain control of the narrative. Greed, jealousy, revenge, and fear had already motivated the murder, but now the stakes had escalated. The crime was no longer simply a puzzle to solve. It was a contest, a battle of wits against a calculating adversary. She summoned Clara quietly, requesting that the young maid accompany her to the library. "Clara," she said gently, "did you notice anything unusual last night? Any visitors? Anyone moving about after we had all retired?" Clara hesitated, wringing her hands. I don't think so, Miss Marple. I was in my room most of the evening, but I did hear a faint noise near the study door around midnight. It sounded like someone rifling through papers." Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The detail was subtle, almost insignificant, but it confirmed her suspicions. The killer had returned under cover of darkness, moving with deliberate stealth. Miss Lewis's behavior, once marked by nervous composure, now struck Marple as deliberate performance. The housekeeper maintained her usual routine, yet there was a rigidity to her movements, a subtle avoidance of areas where the envelope had been stored. Marple noted how frequently her gaze lingered on the spot where the evidence had disappeared, a silent acknowledgement of knowledge she had not yet confessed. Even Mr. Carmichael, immersed in documents, displayed an unusual tension in his posture, an undercurrent of awareness that suggested complicity, or at least an intimate understanding, of the significance of what had been taken. The stolen evidence was not merely a document. It represented the connective tissue of the case, the link between past grievances and present motives. Its removal threatened to unravel the fragile web of insight Marple had been constructing. She reflected on the psychological state of the murderer. Someone capable of premeditated violence had now extended that cunning to obstruction. The challenge was no longer to simply identify the culprit, but to anticipate their moves, to think one step ahead in a battle where every misstep could allow them to vanish further into the shadows. Marple decided to set a subtle test, one that might provoke a reaction revealing knowledge of the envelope's removal. She began by leaving a seemingly inconsequential piece of paper on the desk, a handwritten note marked as "To be reviewed, important legacy details." The note contained nothing of significance, merely a blank sheet with a deliberately suggestive heading. She positioned it where any person aware of the stolen envelope would notice it. Then she observed, with patience born of long experience, the reactions of each household member over the course of the morning. It did not take long. Miss Lewis, passing the desk to straighten a chair, paused briefly, her fingers lingering over the paper, before she drew back sharply, a tiny, almost imperceptible shiver running through her shoulders. Clara, ostensibly dusting nearby, avoided looking directly at the note, but her movements betrayed attention, a subtle hesitation as if she were calculating the safest course. Even Mr. Carmichael's fingers twitched on the edge of a pile of letters. His composure remained outwardly intact, yet his eyes darted briefly to the note, betraying recognition. The test had worked. Someone among them had knowledge of the missing envelope and had felt the tension between concealment and discovery. Marple's strategy now shifted to containment. She ensured that all remaining documents were gathered and secured, subtly relocating sensitive materials and marking their positions to detect any further interference. By creating a controlled environment, she forced the murderer to confront the impossibility of erasing or manipulating all evidence without leaving traces of their movements. The subtle pressure of observation, coupled with careful environmental control, was intended to elicit a misstep, a small but revealing gesture that could point directly to the culprit. The atmosphere in the house grew taut with unspoken tension. The household members moved cautiously, aware now, if only subconsciously, that the detective's gaze extended beyond mere observation of behavior. It encompassed intention and awareness of historical context. The missing envelope, once a quiet relic of past disputes, had become a fulcrum, a leverage point upon which the investigation now pivoted. Every glance, every small gesture, every fleeting hesitation carried weight, and Marple was attuned to each of them. By late afternoon, the pattern of responses became unmistakable. Miss Lewis's overly measured movements, Clara's nervous attentions, and Mr. Carmichael's subtle flinches all aligned with the timeline of the envelope's disappearance. One, or perhaps a combination, had acted under the cover of night to remove a crucial piece of evidence, fully aware of its importance in connecting historical grievances to present motives. Marple had narrowed the circle, though she still lacked confirmation of intent or culpability. Standing quietly by the window, watching the light fall across the polished wooden floors, Marple reflected on the implications. The vanishing evidence had elevated the danger and complexity of the case. The murderer was adaptive, aware and increasingly bold, moving to control the narrative with deliberate calculation. Trust within the household was now fragile. Alliances were uncertain, and every interaction was tinged with caution. Yet, in these very cracks of behavior, Marple saw the path forward. Patience, observation, and subtle provocation would allow her to draw the criminal out, even in the absence of the documents that had been taken. As evening descended, the detective remained vigilant, cataloguing every subtle interaction, every fleeting gesture. The stolen envelope, the vanished proof of past disputes, had complicated the investigation, but it had also revealed the audacity and careful planning of the murderer. Miss Marple knew that the coming days would require strategic precision, the careful orchestration of observation, the use of psychological insight, and the cultivation of small, controlled provocations to uncover the truth. The case had gained momentum, but the vanishing evidence had raised the stakes immeasurably. The murderer was aware, adaptive, and patient, waiting for missteps in a house now charged with suspicion and tension. Yet Marple, patient and perceptive, had already begun to chart the path through deception and concealment, confident that the shadows in which the criminal lurked would soon yield their secrets. The evening descended upon the Penhaligon house with a deceptive calm. Miss Marple had spent hours reviewing the sequence of events in her mind, retracing movements, gestures, and statements, reconstructing the web of motives and hidden connections. The vanishing evidence had heightened the stakes, but she remained confident in her understanding of human behavior, confident that patience and subtlety would reveal the truth. Yet as the household settled for the night, a deeper, more unsettling tension began to build, a tension that would erupt in ways no one had anticipated. Miss Marple was seated in the drawing room, knitting softly as a fire crackled in the hearth. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of floorboards as Miss Lewis moved about tidying the parlour. Clara had retired early, citing a headache, and even Mr. Carmichael had withdrawn to the study, ostensibly to examine legal documents. Once more, the detective's mind, however, was not at rest. The disappearance of the envelope and the reactions she had observed earlier indicated that someone in the household was capable of bold, calculated actions. Someone who might act again, before she had the chance to fully unmask them. Her apprehension proved well-founded. A sudden, sharp crash from the library jolted the household from its uneasy calm. Miss Marple rose instantly, her keen senses alert to both sound and timing. She hurried to the source, noting that the front hall remained empty, suggesting the disturbance had not been staged near the entrance. The library door stood ajar, a faint light spilling through the gap, and the shadows within seemed strangely distorted by the flickering lamplight. As she entered, her heart tightened at the sight before her. Mr. Carmichael lay sprawled across the floor unconscious, a small wound on his temple where the edge of the desk had struck him in the struggle. The scattered papers, including some newly discovered correspondence, fluttered across the floor, and the air was thick with tension and fear. The room had clearly been ransacked, but the attack had been focused, an attempt to intimidate, perhaps even eliminate, the one who held critical knowledge of the case. Miss Marple quickly checked for signs of life, noting that although the solicitor was unconscious, he was breathing steadily. She pressed a handkerchief to his wound and assessed the scene with methodical calm. The attack was not random. It had been executed by someone intimately familiar with the layout of the room, someone who knew the vulnerabilities of the household. The sophistication and precision suggested a perpetrator several steps ahead, someone capable of predicting movements, timing interventions, and creating the illusion of chaos while targeting specific outcomes. Miss Lewis arrived moments later, her face pale, hands trembling as she saw the scene. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't understand. Who could do such a thing?" she stammered. Marple's gaze, however, remained steady, her mind racing through possibilities. The attack could not have been a spontaneous outburst. It was a calculated maneuver to destabilize the investigation, to intimidate and divert attention, and perhaps to buy the perpetrator more time. She directed the housekeeper to fetch water and blankets while she examined the fallen papers. One, in particular, caught her eye, an old ledger previously overlooked that contained references to financial dealings and disputes among the Penhaligon family stretching back decades. In the context of the attack, the ledger's sudden visibility was significant. The assailant may have sought to remove or destroy it, but had overlooked the volume in their haste, or perhaps intentionally left it partially exposed as a challenge. Dire taunt to the detective. Clara arrived then, her eyes wide and hands pressed to her mouth. "Miss Marple, I heard something moving in the hall. I thought it was a branch against the window." Her hesitation, the faint tremor in her voice revealed fear but also awareness. The second crime had underscored a truth Marple had long suspected. The murderer was watching, calculating, and now emboldened. The first crime, the vanishing evidence, had been a warning. This was an escalation. The detective considered the psychological implications. The perpetrator was not merely hiding behind misdirection. They were actively shaping the environment, manipulating perception, and provoking fear to maintain control. Their confidence stemmed from knowledge. Both of the households routines and of the investigation's progress. By attacking Mr. Carmichael, they had demonstrated their reach and precision, signaling that they were capable of acting decisively while remaining unseen. Marple decided the priority must shift. The investigation was no longer simply about reconstructing a crime already committed. It was now also about prevention. The household was vulnerable and the murderer could strike again at any moment. She moved with deliberate calm, quietly instructing Clara and Miss Lewis to remain together in the drawing room under her watch, while she examined potential points of vulnerability throughout the house. Doors and windows were checked, drawers, secured, and key objects, the dollhouse correspondence and other symbolic items, were relocated to a controlled space where the murderer's interference could be monitored. The detective also considered the profile of the assailant. The precision and forethought required for such an attack suggested someone methodical, patient, and intimately aware of the household's dynamics. Greed, jealousy, revenge, and fear were already motivations, but this act of aggression revealed a level of strategic cunning. The murderer was willing to escalate the stakes, to manipulate evidence, and to confront those who might impede their plans. The challenge was immense, but Marple's understanding of human behavior and her ability to anticipate subtle reactions gave her a distinct advantage if she remained patient and observant. By late evening, the household had settled once again, though the atmosphere was taut with unease. Mr. Carmichael rested under careful supervision, Clara remained visibly shaken, and Miss Lewis moved with a calculated composure that suggested both concern and awareness. Marple herself sat quietly in the drawing room, reviewing the sequence of events, tracing potential motives, and considering how the attack aligned with the previous vanishing evidence. The escalation confirmed her long-held suspicion. The murderer was several steps ahead, manipulating events, and now prepared to confront anyone who threatened exposure. The detective's thoughts returned to the dollhouse. Its miniature rooms and fractured figurine had been central to the first crime, and the symbolism now seemed even more pointed. The deliberate placement, the subtle message encoded in small objects, and the manipulation of household perception were hallmarks of a mind both creative and precise. The second attack confirmed that the perpetrator was not merely reactive, they were proactive, shaping the investigation through intimidation and careful orchestration. Miss Marple understood that patience and observation would be her greatest tools in the coming days. The second crime, while alarming, also revealed the perpetrator's boldness and their reliance on misdirection. Every gesture, every reaction, every interaction was now part of a larger pattern waiting to be deciphered. The challenge was to prevent another tragedy while drawing the murderer out of hiding, using subtlety and strategic provocation rather than force or confrontation. As she gazed at the dollhouse once more, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows across its miniature rooms, Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of a plan. The house itself would become a stage, the movements of each person a script to be subtly guided. The murderer's audacity, evident in the attack on Mr. Carmichael, had revealed their confidence, but it had also given her insight into their psychology. The next step would require careful orchestration, precise timing, and an unwavering focus on the faintest gestures and inconsistencies. The unexpected twist had changed the rules of the game. The investigation was no longer merely about solving a past crime, it was about preventing future ones, anticipating the actions of a calculating adversary, and using observation and human insight as tools to expose a criminal several steps ahead. Miss Marple, patient and perceptive, had begun to map the perilous landscape of deception, aware that each decision now carried greater consequence, and that the next move, hers or the murderer's, could determine the outcome of the entire case. Miss Marple spent the following morning immersed in quiet observation, moving through the Penhaligon house with the patience of someone who trusted the mind to notice what eyes alone might overlook. The second crime, the attack on Mr. Carmichael, had left a ripple of unease, but it had also provided her with subtle clues, small behavioral nuances that, when pieced together, suggested a method to the chaos. While the household tried to resume a semblance of normality, Marple's mind was attuned to every gesture, every word, and every object, no matter how insignificant it seemed. She began with the dollhouse, which had already proven to be a symbolic centerpiece. The fractured figurine had drawn attention before, but this time she noticed something new. The angle at which it had been broken, combined with the precise arrangement of the miniature furniture, mirrored not just the library, but the paths taken by various household members on the night of the murder. Marple traced the miniature corridors with her finger, comparing them to the floorboards, the placement of rugs, and the slight scuff marks she had observed. The alignment was deliberate, a subtle code-encoding movement and intent in miniature form. She had glimpsed it before, but the second crime, the attack on Mr. Carmichael, suddenly cast it in a sharper, more urgent light. Next, she turned her attention to the staff. Clara's nervous glances, once interpreted as general fear or timidity, now took on a new meaning. There was a rhythm to her movements, a pattern in when and where she appeared in rooms, which suggested awareness of both the dollhouse's significance and the envelope that had vanished. Miss Lewis, similarly, displayed careful timing in her actions, her habits almost ritualistic, the way she dusted around certain objects but never touched others, the way she positioned herself to observe without seeming to. Even Mr. Carmichael, though recovering from the attack, revealed small tells, an unusual pause before handling documents, a glance toward the desk that lingered too long, the repeated checking of shelves that had nothing of value. Marple's attention then shifted to minor details she had previously dismissed. A small handkerchief, embroidered with initials not belonging to any current household member, left folded neatly on a side table. A chair slightly out of place, its positioning almost imperceptibly altered. A faint smudge on the handle of a drawer that no one should have opened that day. Each was tiny, almost meaningless in isolation, yet together they formed a lattice of subtle signals, a network of actions and reactions that, when read correctly, mapped the murderer's movements, intentions, and psychology. The breakthrough came when Marple recalled a seemingly trivial comment made by Clara while serving afternoon tea. "I thought it odd, Ma'am, how some things move even when no one is there." The words had seemed like nervous chatter at the time, a child's comment reflecting superstition or imagination. But now, in the context of the emerging behavioral patterns and symbolic placement of objects, it became clear that Clara had been aware of manipulation, of small changes orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of the house. The comment was not idle. It was a subtle acknowledgement of interference and control, of movements designed to convey or conceal information. Piecing together these observations, Marple began to see the pattern that had eluded others. The glove, behind the cushion, the broken figurine in the dollhouse, the smudged bookmark, the vanishing evidence, and the attack on Mr. Carmichael were not random acts. They were components of a carefully orchestrated sequence, a deliberate choreography executed to mislead, intimidate, and manipulate perception. Each act, when analyzed in isolation, suggested one thing. When seen collectively, they revealed the mind behind them, the subtle genius of misdirection that had allowed the murderer to stay several steps ahead. She also noted the psychological aspects of the pattern. The murderer had relied not only on physical concealment, but on the orchestration of fear, uncertainty, and misperception. By controlling what others saw and how they interpreted it, the perpetrator had constructed a narrative in which the authorities, the household, and even the detective herself might be led astray. The minor acts, the placement of objects, the timing of gestures, the manipulation of light and shadow were not incidental. They were deliberate signals, a communication of intent that only a careful observer could decode. As Marple traced the sequences in her mind, she realized something remarkable. The key to the entire case had been visible all along, obscured only by the apparent chaos of events and the distractions of dramatic incidents. The pattern had been encoded in the minutiae, the small habits, the minor placements, the gestures unnoticed by those eager for immediate resolution. The murderer's brilliance lay in this subtlety. The crime and its misdirection existed on multiple levels simultaneously, requiring both observation and intuition to unravel. She returned to the dollhouse one more time, examining the figurine and its surrounding miniatures with renewed focus. The positioning of each item, once confusing, now revealed a logic. The sequence mirrored real-world interactions among the household members, reflecting the movements, timing, and even the relationships between the potential suspects. The careful arrangement of objects functioned as both a map and a message, providing the perceptive observer with a means to understand what had transpired and, crucially, who had orchestrated the events. Miss Marple then reviewed the interactions of the past days in her mind, the vanishing evidence, the subtle reactions to hypothetical scenarios, the attack on Mr. Carmichael, all aligned within this pattern. The person responsible was not merely motivated by greed or jealousy, nor had they acted impulsively. They had planned each step, anticipating responses, calculating risk, and using human psychology to maintain control. The pattern, once deciphered, illuminated not just the sequence of actions but the mind behind them. Meticulous, patient, and dangerously aware of how small details could manipulate perception. By evening, Marple had reconstructed the trajectory of events with remarkable clarity. The seemingly disconnected incidents, the glove, the envelope, the dollhouse, the attack, were in fact parts of a single cohesive plan. Each had served a purpose, both practical and psychological, designed to confuse, intimidate, and obscure. The murderer's careful orchestration had relied on the household's assumptions, the authorities' eagerness for closure, and the natural human tendency to overlook the insignificant. The detective understood now that her earlier observations, while helpful, had been fragments. Only by recognizing the emerging pattern, the combination of small gestures, subtle manipulations, and symbolic acts, could the case be approached with precision. The key had been in plain sight all along, hidden in the interplay of the household's movements, the placement of objects, and the psychology of concealment. With the pattern fully emerging, Miss Marple felt the first true sense of control in the investigation. The murderer remained at large, aware and cunning, but the web of actions, objects and signals had provided a roadmap. Each subtle detail, each micro-behavior, had become a clue, and together they formed an intricate lattice pointing unmistakably toward the culprit. Patience, observation, and careful deduction had revealed what the chaos alone had obscured. Say, mind behind the misdirection, a pattern in the deception and a path toward resolution. The detective, knitting quietly in the drawing room as dusk settled outside, allowed herself a small, satisfied sigh. The pattern emerges. The chaos had begun to yield to understanding, and the path forward, to confronting the murderer, unraveling their motives, and securing justice, was now visible. Miss Marple knew that the next steps would require precision and subtlety, but, for the first time, she felt the pieces align, the threads interwoven into a coherent design that only patience and keen observation could have revealed. Miss Marple had always trusted in the quiet persistence of truth. It had a way of surfacing, even when buried beneath layers of deceit, fear, and deliberate misdirection. Now, as the pattern became clearer in her mind, she felt that the time had come to probe more deeply, not into the evidence that everyone had been staring at, but into the human heart that had driven such ruthless actions. Murder, after all, was not only about opportunity and method, it was about motive, and motive often revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in the fragile, hidden places of the soul. She sat in the drawing room that evening, her knitting needles, clicking softly, while the members of the Penhaligon household moved about with unease. Clara carried in tea but set the tray down with trembling hands, her eyes darting toward Miss Marple before quickly lowering. Miss Lewis adjusted a vase of flowers, unnecessarily her composure brittle. Mr. Carmichael, still recovering from the attack, pretended to read, though his hands trembled slightly whenever he turned a page. The room was thick with tension, but beneath the silence, Miss Marple could hear the deeper rhythm of guilt and fear pressing in. It was not money, she told herself. The missing envelope, the broken figurine, the vanished glove, all these had suggested greed or blackmail at first glance. But no, those were red herrings. Nor was it simply power, though there had been attempts at control through misdirection. And revenge, while tempting to imagine, did not fully explain the cold patience and almost obsessive symbolism that had shaped the crimes. The truth was deeper, buried in old wounds, festering resentments, and the peculiarities of human psychology. The key, she realized, lay in the dollhouse, not merely as a model of the murder scene, but as a mirror of obsession. The arrangement of furniture, the symbolism of the broken figurine, it was not only a message to mislead. It was also an expression, an intimate confession disguised as artifice. Whoever had staged the dollhouse had revealed not just their cleverness, but their inner world. And that world was one haunted not by greed, but by humiliation. The breakthrough came when she recalled the embroidered handkerchief left carelessly on the side table. The initials did not belong to any of the current household, but they tied back to an older connection, someone who had once lived under this roof and whose memory lingered like a shadow. Inquiries into the family's past had revealed a scandal, long buried, a sibling cast out for disgrace, a romance destroyed, and whispers of betrayal that had never fully left the family name untarnished. When Miss Marple drew the threads together, the motive revealed itself like a cruel bloom opening in the dark. This crime was not about wealth or even survival. It was about erasing shame. The murderer had grown up in the shadow of secrets, humiliated by association, forced to watch others thrive while they bore the stain of past disgrace. The crime was not an act of mere vengeance, but a desperate attempt to rewrite the story, to turn the humiliation outward, to force others to suffer the same gnawing wound that had festered in silence for years. She saw it clearly now in their behaviors. Miss Lewis's composure, so carefully maintained, had cracked at odd moments, whenever the past was hinted at, whenever a memory surfaced. Clara's nervousness was not just fear of violence, but fear of truth, of knowing too much about the bitter undercurrents beneath the household's polite veneer. Mr. Carmichael's obsession with papers and documents, his near paranoia, was tied not to greed, but to the awareness that the scandal might surface again if the wrong eyes saw the wrong things. It was Miss Lewis, however, who drew Marple's sharpest focus. Her habits, placing objects with ritual care, timing her movements, manipulating the dollhouse, were the acts not of a servant following orders, but of a mind working out old grudges through small symbolic acts. Miss Lewis had once been more than she now appeared, not merely a housekeeper but a relative, bound to the family by blood and shadowed by scandal. Her role as servant had been a lifelong penance imposed by circumstance and by pride. She had lived for years inside the walls of a house that both sheltered and humiliated her, watching others live freely while she performed the quiet labor of invisibility. This, Marple thought, was the true motive. Not greed, not power, not revenge in the simple sense. It was humiliation transmuted into rage, a life of being overlooked, diminished, remembered only as a shameful footnote, and the crime had been her way of taking control at last. By staging the murder with such precision, by using the dollhouse as both a weapon and confession, Miss Lewis had sought to expose the hypocrisy of the household, to force them to live with the same humiliation she had borne silently for decades. Miss Marple let this realization settle in her mind, like the final piece of a jigsaw puzzle. She knew that to confront Miss Lewis directly would be dangerous. Humiliation, once unmasked, often transformed into a desperate ferocity. Yet she also understood that revealing the truth was inevitable. Crimes rooted in such deep wounds could not remain hidden forever, for the motive itself demanded to be seen, to be acknowledged. That night, she wrote quietly in her notebook, not only the timeline of events, but the psychology that underpinned them. She described the slow evolution of rage born from shame, the way humiliation had festered into obsession, and how every broken object and staged clue had been not just practical misdirection but symbolic expression. The motive, once exposed, was both shocking and tragically human. For in the end, the murderer was not driven by profit, nor by the thrill of violence, but by something far more devastating, the need to undo a lifetime of invisibility, to lash out against the chains of disgrace that had silenced and diminished them. The murder had been, in its twisted way, an act of self-assertion, a declaration that the past could no longer be borne. Miss Marple, her knitting finally set aside, stared, into the fire with a mixture of pity and grim understanding. Such motives, she knew, were the most dangerous of all, for they sprang not from desire but from pain. They were wounds masquerading as crimes, and wounds, when left unattended for too long, often demanded blood before they could heal. The household, oblivious to the full shape of the truth, moved uneasily around her. But Miss Marple knew that the time for revelation was drawing near. The hidden motive had been uncovered, and it was far more terrible than any simple greed or revenge. It was humiliation transformed into violence, shame transmuted into murder, and that truth, however dreadful, could not remain concealed much longer. The night pressed heavily upon the Penhaligon estate, the air thick with storm clouds threatening rain. Within the drawing-room, lamps glowed warmly, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls like spectres of the past. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair, knitting needles resting idle on her lap, though she had not so much as touched the yarn in an hour. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for truth had come. The assembled household bore the look of uneasy guests in a theatre, waiting for a performance whose script none of them had been given. Clara perched nervously on the edge of a settee, wringing her hands in silence. Mr. Carmichael leaned heavily on his cane, his eyes flickering toward the door as though considering retreat. Even Inspector Graves, called in earlier at Miss Marple's quiet request, stood in the corner with folded arms, his usual bluster muted by the peculiar gravity in the room. And at the heart of it all, Miss Lewis stood stiff and composed, her face pale but unreadable, her eyes glittering like dark glass. "Thank you all for gathering," Miss Marple began, her voice calm, almost conversational, though beneath it ran a current of steel. "We have all been most dreadfully unsettled by the crimes committed under this roof, but I fear we have misunderstood their nature. We have imagined theft, blackmail, or even revenge of a rather ordinary sort. Yet the truth lies deeper." Miss Lewis's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. "The murder," Miss Marple continued, "was not about money, nor about simple anger. It was about humiliation. A humiliation that has festered for decades. A humiliation born, quietly, until silence itself became unbearable." Clara gasped, and Mr. Carmichael muttered something unintelligible, but Miss Marple's gaze never left Miss Lewis. "You see," she went on, "the dollhouse was not only a reconstruction of the crime scene, it was also a confession. Each piece was arranged not merely to deceive but to express something. The broken figurine, the embroidered handkerchief, the precise placement of objects, these were not clues to throw us off, but rather symbols of a life long endured. Her life lived in the shadow of disgrace." Inspector Graves shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Are you saying—" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as it was unyielding. "The killer is not some outside intruder. It is someone, within these walls, someone who has lived with us all along, invisible yet indispensable. Miss Lewis." The name struck the room like a thunderclap. Clara rose to her feet in shock. Mr. Carmichael's cane slipped from his hand and clattered. To the floor, Miss Lewis did not flinch. She merely straightened her back, her hands clasped tightly before her. "You speak with great confidence, Miss Marple," she said evenly, though her voice trembled at the edges. "But confidence is not proof." "Ah," said Miss Marple, gently, "but proof is precisely what I have." She reached into her knitting basket and drew out a folded handkerchief, embroidered with faded initials. "This was found in the side room near the broken figurine. These are not the initials of any current member of the household. They belong to your mother, do they not, Miss Lewis? A woman cast out in scandal years ago. The disgrace of her name fell upon you as well, and from that day onward you were never treated as an equal, but as a servant in your own family's home. That humiliation shaped everything. The dollhouse, the careful staging, the symbolism of brokenness, it was all a reflection of your life here." For the first time, Miss Lewis's composure cracked. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Her eyes darted toward Clara, toward Carmichael, toward the floor. Miss Marple's voice softened, though it carried the unrelenting weight of truth. "You did not kill for money, nor even for hatred alone. You killed because the burden of invisibility became too heavy. You wanted them all to feel what you had felt for so many years, the sting of disgrace, the suffocating weight of shame. That is why you staged the scene with such precision. That is why you could not resist leaving symbols behind. You wished not only to strike, but to be seen. A silence hung in the room, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Then, suddenly Miss Lewis laughed. It was a strange sound, half bitter, half sorrowful. "Seen," she repeated, her voice low. "Yes." At last. Inspector Graves stepped forward, hand outstretched as though expecting resistance. But Miss Marple raised a hand. "Not yet, Inspector. Let her speak." Miss Lewis's gaze swept the room, fierce now, burning with years of suppressed fury. "Do you know what it is to serve tea to those who mock you behind closed doors? To polish silver that once belonged to your family? To hear whispers of scandal every time your name is mentioned? I lived among you like a ghost, never acknowledged, never respected, invisible. But I was here. I saw everything, and I remembered." Her voice rose, trembling with long-buried passion. "You all thought yourselves so proper, so untouchable, but your secrets were no cleaner than mine. You forced me to carry shame that was not even mine to bear. So I gave it back to you, the only way left to me, through blood, through a scene you would never forget." Clara began to sob, hiding her face in her hands. Carmichael muttered angrily, though his voice shook more from fear than outrage. Miss Lewis, chest heaving, seemed to gather herself. Then, in one sharp movement, she turned toward the window as if calculating an escape. But Graves was faster, intercepting her with a firm grip on her arm. "Enough of this," he growled. "You'll come with me now." For a heartbeat it seemed she might struggle, might claw or strike in some last desperate act, but then her shoulders slumped and the fire in her eyes dimmed. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "You know now. That's all I wanted." Inspector Graves secured her with efficient hands, but Miss Marple kept her gaze fixed upon the defeated woman. There was no triumph in her expression, only quiet sorrow. She knew, as she always did, that murder was not born solely from wickedness, but from wounds too deep to mend. Miss Lewis was both villain and victim, destroyer and destroyed. As the storm finally broke outside, rain lashing against the windows, Miss Marple folded her hands once more over her knitting. The pieces had fallen into place. The confrontation had ended. The truth, however bitter, had been laid bare, and though justice would now follow, she knew that nothing could ever truly erase the shadows of humiliati. The storm passed quickly, that night, leaving the estate steeped in damp silence. By morning, the heavy clouds had thinned into pale streaks of grey, as though the world itself had breathed a sigh of relief after the previous evening's grim revelations. Within the drawing room, however, there was no such calm. Miss Lewis had been taken into custody under Inspector Graves's firm but unsympathetic hand. Clara, still pale and shaken, had retired to her room. Mr. Carmichael had retreated to the library, muttering bitterly about disgrace and betrayal, though one might have noticed his relief was somewhat too forceful, as if rehearsed. And Miss Marple, quiet as ever, sat with her teacup untouched, her mind circling restlessly. For all the neatness of last night's confrontation, she could not help but feel something was amiss. Yes, Miss Lewis had confessed, in a manner of speaking. Yes, the symbols in the dollhouse and the handkerchief with its damning initials had tied her to the crime. And yet, Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that truth often lay in layers, one beneath another, hidden until the final peal revealed its heart. It was not until later that morning, when Inspector Graves returned to collect Miss Marple's formal statement, that the uneasy puzzle began to shift. "She'll hang, no doubt of it," the inspector said with a gruff satisfaction. "Cold-blooded, clever, like a spider sitting in the center of her web. All that talk of humiliation and shame, enough to turn anyone's stomach. At least it's finished now." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Do you think so?" "Inspector," Graves frowned. "What do you mean?" She set down her cup with deliberate care. "I mean, do you not find it curious that a woman who has endured silence and invisibility for decades should suddenly cry out for recognition in such a theatrical manner? Confessions, symbolic dollhouses, embroidered relics. It seems rather contrived, don't you think? More like a play being performed for an audience than the raw expression of desperation. The inspector shifted uncomfortably. "Well, criminals do strange things." She admitted as much herself. "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly, "and yet, one must ask, was she confessing or was she playing the part written for her?" That thought lingered long after Graves departed. It clung to Miss Marple's mind as she wandered the garden path in the cool drizzle, her eyes turned inward. Slowly, like a puzzle piece clicking into place, the truth revealed itself. It was not Miss Lewis who had orchestrated the performance. She had been the weapon, yes, but not the hand that wielded it. The revelation came to its sharp point that evening, when the household was gathered once more at Graves' insistence to provide final statements. Miss Marple, knitting in her lap once more, lifted her head at last. "Forgive me," she said gently, "but before we conclude, there is one final matter to address. A loose thread, if you will, for though Miss Lewis has admitted her guilt, I cannot help but see the shape of another mind behind her actions, a colder, cleverer mind." All eyes turned to her. Clara paled again, Mr. Carmichael stiffened, and Inspector Graves let out a frustrated sigh. "Now really, Miss Marple, must we go through this again?" "Yes, Inspector," she said firmly, "for you see, Miss Lewis was not the author of this crime. She was its instrument. The true architect sits among us still." A ripple of unease coursed through the room. "Consider," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but inexorable, "the handkerchief. Why leave such a piece behind, unless one wished the crime to be traced back to Miss Lewis? And consider, too, the dollhouse. The painstaking staging of the scene, the symbols, the theatrics, all too elaborate for a woman consumed by humiliation and rage. No, this was someone else's design, someone who needed Miss Lewis to be both the executioner and the scapegoat, her." Eyes turned slowly until they rested on Mr. Carmichael. "Sir," she said gently, "you have played the role of outraged patriarch most convincingly. Yet your bitterness rings hollow. For it was you who had most to lose should certain family secrets come to light. It was you who guided Miss Lewis, quietly, carefully, feeding her resentment, sharpening it into a blade you could wield when convenient. She believed she was striking for herself, but in truth she was striking for you, and you, ever the strategist, made certain that her shame would mask your own." A collective gasp swept the room. Clara half rose from her seat, staring at Carmichael with wide, horrified eyes. The old man's face had blanched, but he forced a laugh. "Preposterous. You've gone too far, madam. The woman confessed. What more do you want?" Miss Marple's gaze was unflinching. "Confessed, yes, but notice her words. She never once described the act itself, the placing of the weapon, the precise execution of the crime. Only her feelings, her humiliation, her long invisibility. Because those were her truths. But the plan, the staging, the manipulation, that was yours. You orchestrated her confession just as you orchestrated the crime, and like a dutiful actress, she performed the part you gave her. The silence that followed was taut, electric. Then Clara spoke, her voice breaking. "Uncle, is it true?" Carmichael's cane rattled against the floor as his hands trembled. His eyes darted to Graves, to Marple, to the door. "She was weak," he hissed suddenly. "So weak. All it took was a few words, a few reminders of her disgrace. I offered her a chance at vindication and she took it. It was her hand, not mine." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "but it was your mind, Mr. Carmichael. And in crimes such as these, that is the greater guilt." Graves stepped forward heavily, his jaw set. This time there was no hesitation as he seized Carmichael's arm. The old man sagged against his cane, his defiance crumbling into silence. Miss Marple watched with weary eyes. She felt no triumph, only the familiar sorrow that came with untangling the darkest threads of human nature. Miss Lewis had indeed killed, but she had been driven to it by a master manipulator, a man who had hidden his corruption behind bluster and false propriety. The household would never be the same. As the inspector led Carmichael away, Clara sat, frozen in her chair, staring into the middle distance as though her world had shattered. Miss Marple, with quiet compassion, reached out and touched her hand. There, my dear," she said softly. "The truth is often cruel, but better cruel truth than comfortable falsehood. At least now the shadows are gone, and the light may come in. The case, once thought closed, had twisted one last time, revealing that behind every villain there might be another, hidden deeper still. And in that revelation, Miss Marple's genius had been tested one final time, and proven once more that nothing escaped her watchful eye, on that had driven Miss Lewis to such desperate extremes. The day after Carmichael's arrest dawned cold and bright, as though the storm that had haunted the manor had been swept away with all its shadows. Yet within the household, the air remained heavy, thick with disbelief, grief, and the unspoken dread of what lay ahead. Clara scarcely spoke, her eyes hollow from shock. The servants whispered in corners, uncertain whom to trust now that the great patriarch had been exposed as the architect of so much misery. Miss Marple, calm as ever, moved quietly among them, offering tea here, a steady word there. But her mind, though gentle in manner, remained sharp as a blade. For while Carmichael's outburst the previous night had confirmed her suspicions, she knew the law would require more than implication. The inspector, stern though he was, needed evidence, something beyond a trembling confession given under pressure. Thus, when Inspector Graves returned that morning, his face grim, it was no surprise that he bore troubling news. "He's denying." "Hit," Graves said, his hat in his hands. "Says he was provoked, made to speak nonsense. He insists Miss Lewis acted alone, and that any suggestion he guided her is malicious fantasy. Without proof, solid proof, the magistrate will struggle to hold him." A murmur of unease passed through the room. Clara pressed a hand to her lips. "But you heard him last night." "We all did." Graves shook his head. "Words spoken in the heat of the moment won't hold. His solicitor is already spinning the tale, an old man accused unfairly by a meddling spinster. I'm afraid, Miss Marple, unless we can produce something more tangible, Carmichael may yet slip the noose." At this, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with quiet resolve. "Then it is fortunate," she said, "that I have been attending to precisely that matter." All gathered once again in the drawing-room, the same chamber where so much had been revealed before. Carmichael sat stiffly in his chair, his solicitor at his side, his expression one of carefully composed indignation. Yet behind the mask of righteousness flickered the faintest shadow of fear. Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, looked up at him kindly. "Mr. Carmichael," she began softly, "it is not my habit to accuse unjustly. Indeed, I take no pleasure in seeing a man's reputation crumble. But in this case, justice requires that we peel back the final layer of concealment, and so I must explain, for everyone's sake, the clues that reveal your hand." The room hushed. Even Graves leaned forward slightly, though he had heard much already. "Firstly," Miss Marple said, "the dollhouse. At first glance it appeared to be Miss Lewis's work, a theatrical expression of her rage. But one must ask, where would she have obtained such precise knowledge of the household's layout? The little details known only to one who had lived here intimately. Miss Lewis served on the periphery. She was never in the rooms of influence. But you, Mr. Carmichael, you presided over this house. Only you could have recreated it in such detail." Carmichael's solicitor began to protest, but she continued, her voice unyielding. "Secondly, the embroidery. It was discovered tucked in a drawer Miss Lewis used, but the style of stitch, Inspector, was not hers. I noticed it the very first evening. Miss Lewis worked with a neat, tight hand born of necessity and thrift. The piece in question bore a looser, older style. The very style, if one recalls, that adorned the seat cushions you so proudly claimed were your late wife's handiwork, Mr. Carmichael. In truth, it was your stitch, not hers." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Clara's eyes widened with dawning horror. "And finally," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing mid-stitch, "there is the matter of the confession itself. Miss Lewis spoke eloquently of her shame, her long invisibility, her humiliation. Yet not once did she describe the act itself, the mechanics of how she committed the crime. Why? Because she had not devised it. That portion was yours, Mr. Carmichael. You planted the relics, arranged the dollhouse, and whispered the script into her ear until she believed it was her truth. But the truth was never hers alone." The room fell into silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Carmichael's composure cracked at last. His face twisted, rage and fear warring in his eyes. "She was willing!" he spat suddenly, rising with trembling hands upon his cane. "Do you hear me? She wanted revenge. I merely gave her the means. Why should I suffer alone when she played her part so gladly?" Graves stepped forward at once, his expression grim. "That will do, Carmichael. You've damned yourself twice over. There'll be no slipping free now." The solicitor muttered in vain, but Carmichael sank back into his chair, his defiance draining away. The proud patriarch who once commanded the house now looked a frail, broken man, trapped by his own cleverness turned against him. Clara, tears streaking her cheeks, whispered hoarsely, "Uncle, how could you?" But he gave no answer. That night, peace returned, if only a fragile, tentative peace. Carmichael was led away in chains, his reputation in ruins, his legacy forever stained. Miss Lewis, though guilty, was seen with new pity, not merely as a murderer, but as a pawn in a darker game. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served, and yet as Miss Marple sat alone in her guest chamber, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, she could not help but reflect on the shadows that lingered. For justice in such cases was never complete. A life had been lost, a household shattered, and even the triumph of truth carried with it the ache of sorrow. She sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes," she murmured softly to herself, "the law will do its part, but hearts will ache. Long after the gallows falls silent, that too is the cost of wickedness." Outside, the rain began again, gentle this time, as though the heavens themselves wept for all that had been lost. The manor grew still in the days following Carmichael's arrest, where once the corridors had echoed with whispers, clinking glasses, and hushed footsteps. There lingered now only silence. The household, diminished by tragedy, seemed frozen in time, as though afraid to draw breath lest it stir some ghost of what had passed. Miss Marple, ever composed, made her farewells with gentle efficiency. She reassured Clara, comforted the trembling staff, and thanked Inspector Graves with polite modesty, though all knew it was her quiet insight that had cracked the case. With her small suitcase in hand and her knitting neatly folded on top, she prepared to leave the great house behind. Yet even as the carriage awaited her at the gate, she paused by the threshold, her gaze resting on the shadows that clung to the stairwell. Her instincts, honed by years of observation, whispered that something, some small thread, remained loose. Clara, pale but resolute, accompanied her to the door. "I cannot thank you enough, Miss Marple," she said softly. "Without you, we might never have uncovered the truth. I feel as though I've been sleepwalking through my own home, blind to what was right before me." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Grief and habit can blind us, my dear. Do not be too hard on yourself. It is always those who look from the outside who see most clearly." Clara nodded, though her eyes drifted toward the dining room door, still shut tight. A tremor passed over her face. "It's strange, though justice has been done, I don't feel at peace. I still hear the echo of his words, that Uncle was not the only one who had a hand in it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her gaze sharpened. Yes, his outburst did contain peculiar phrasing. A man so careful with words rarely blurts without purpose. Clara frowned. "You think he meant something?" Marple did not answer, directly. Instead, she pressed Clara's hand once more. "Guard your heart, my dear. Shadows rarely linger without cause." The carriage rattled down the drive, the manor shrinking into the mist behind. Miss Marple settled into her seat, her mind turning once more over the evidence, the confessions, the tiny details others had missed. It was a habit she could not easily set aside, for the truth she knew was rarely as tidy as the law would have it. Her thoughts returned to the embroidery, the clumsy stitch Carmichael had used, so different from Miss Lewis's careful hand. And yet, there had been a second piece, hadn't there? A fragment left in the sewing basket in the corner of the servants' quarters. Neat, precise stitches, but bearing the same strange motif as the looser work found in Carmichael's study. A shared design executed by two different hands. Why should that be? Her brow furrowed. And then the dollhouse. A perfect replica of the manor, yes, but she recalled with sudden clarity that one room had been slightly altered, The nursery, long unused, had been depicted not as it was, but as it had once been, with furniture that had been removed years earlier. Only someone with long memory of the house as it was, not merely as it stood, could have crafted it so. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Carmichael had lived here, yes, but so too had others. And one in particular had remained unusually silent throughout the ordeal, Clara herself. She dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it arose, chiding herself for doubting the poor woman, and yet the echo of Carmichael's furious words returned, "She was willing, do you hear me? She wanted revenge, I merely gave her the means." Had he spoken only of Miss Lewis? Or had his rage pointed elsewhere, at another accomplice, another partner in deceit? The carriage passed through the village, where shopkeepers paused to stare and nod respectfully. Miss Marple smiled back, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of the closed nursery door, of the faint scent of lavender that had clung to Clara's shawl, of the way Clara's eyes had darted not toward Carmichael during the confrontation, but toward the inspector, measuring his reactions carefully, almost anxiously. And then, of course, there was the smallest detail of all, a misplaced key. On the night of the storm, Clara had insisted she had been asleep when the first scream rang out. Yet the master key to the locked cabinet in which the relic had been kept was later discovered in her writing desk, hidden beneath correspondence. It had been explained away as accident, as oversight. But Miss Marple knew better than most that keys rarely wandered without intent. The carriage jolted over a stone, breaking her reverie. She closed her eyes and folded her hands in her lap. Her face composed. "Perhaps," she whispered to herself, "there is another story still buried in that house. Perhaps one day it will come to light. Until then." She left the thought unfinished, allowing it to drift away like the mist curling over the fields. For mysteries, she knew, were rarely resolved entirely. They lingered, waiting patiently, until some curious mind stumbled across the thread and pulled. By the time the carriage reached the railway station, the sun had broken through the clouds, painting the village in pale gold. Miss Marple descended, her small figure dwarfed by the platform, and settled on a bench with her knitting once more in hand. To any observer, she appeared the picture of serenity, an elderly lady content to pass the time with wool and needles. But within, her mind hummed with quiet speculation, the pieces of the puzzle still shifting. Justice had been served, yes, and yet. She thought again of the embroidery, the dollhouse, the misplaced key. Threads left dangling, unknotted. Was Carmichael truly the mastermind, or had he, in the end, been merely another piece on the board, moved by subtler hands? A train whistle blew in the distance, long and mournful. Miss Marple gathered her things ready to board, ready for the next case that fate would place in her path. But as she rose, a faint smile touched her lips, a smile that spoke not of satisfaction, but of curiosity, for though one mystery had ended, another had already begun, and so with the gentle click of her shoes on the platform, Miss Marple vanished into the steam, leaving behind only questions and the certainty that somewhere in the quiet corners of human hearts, secrets yet waited to be revealed.